Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Libel. In this presidential election cycle, both Democrats and Republicans claim to be tough on China. What does that actually mean? In fact, what does the American public really know about the China of today? On this edition of the program, we attempt to separate myths from reality. Cross-talking China and more, I'm joined by my guest, Tom Watkins in Detroit. He is president and CEO of TDW and Associates, as well as a regular contributor to ChinaUSFocus.com. And we have James Bradley in New Zealand. He is a New York Times #1 best-selling author of China Mirage, as well as host of his own podcast, Untold Pacific. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to New Zealand first. James, China is mentioned over and over in this election cycle in the United States. Though both parties like to differentiate themselves, it seems like the message is the same. In following this election and how China is objectified, I would say, what is the biggest misconception about China as it's reported by the media? Go ahead.
Too big of a question. It would take too many hours if we're going to talk about misconceptions about China. No, I would make the case that with China's population, #1 country in the world, it's the least understood country by Americans. Fewer Americans have been to China over the last 400 years compared to going to Europe. But in terms of the election, if I was President Trump's campaign advisor, this is what I would say to him. I would say, President Trump, there's about 11 swing states. They're Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I mean, you know what they are. In those swing states in October, November, when you're campaigning, there's going to be two problems for the voters. #1, vaccine, COVID, disease, whatever you want to call it, mass, lockdown, that whole bailiwick, #1. #2, they're broke. No jobs, no money. Big problem regarding maybe even food. So you've got these two problems, disease and no jobs. And guess what? It's China's fault. The disease came from China, and Joe Biden loves China. The jobs, where are your jobs? I've got the answer. Joe Biden's administration offshored them. It's China's fault, and Joe Biden loves China. You're going to win those swing states. Don't worry.
Okay, well, I wish it were that simple, okay, because American industry has been hollowed out. I would say a number of presidents allowed it to happen and watched American CEOs do it, okay? So I think we need like a church commission to investigate how this all happened here. Tom, let me go to you. I mean, you're an old China hand. Same question to you, because I've been living in Russia for 22 years, and every single news cycle, Russia is misunderstood. And I'd have to agree with James. China's even more misunderstood it, and that's quite remarkable. Go ahead.
Well, you know, I remember reading, I think it was in 2000 or 2001, the National Geographic said that the American people are ignorant about all things Asian, and especially China. And quite honestly, it hasn't gotten any better of late. This election cycle is not much different than the past. I agree with James that the amplifier is going to be around the blame China strategy. The GOP memo that came out about a month ago, talks explicitly about that. When anything comes up, blame China. The issue to me, though, is that may be a good political strategy. The question is whether or not that's really going to set us in a good position as we move forward. As James pointed out, 1.4 billion people, a large economy, growing all the time. How are we going to assure that China doesn't become a nightmare more than a dream, where we can find ways in order to work together? We need to get past this election cycle, and whoever is elected is going to have some repair work to do to assure that China's rise doesn't come at the U.S.'s demise.
Okay, well, but James, this kind of begs the question because people are talking about a new Cold War, which I don't like that phrase because the Cold War that all of us remember was very specific and it was very ideologically driven. This is not the case here. So does America need China as an enemy? It seems that American foreign policy always is looking for the next Hitler, and it looks like China is the next Hitler in the minds of the foreign policy blob. Because I'd like to point out, up until about February of this year, it was hardly ever mentioned that China is a communist country and the Communist Party of China. They constantly pound away at that. And that's obviously an echo to the Cold War that we all lived through. Go ahead, James.
This is a very old tradition in American politics and in American history that the Chinese, if you listen to Pompeo and all the spokespeople, there's the Chinese people. We love the Chinese people. All the Chinese haters say it first. The Chinese people are wonderful, hardworking people. We have nothing against them, but it's those commies. So 200 years ago, it was the emperor. The Chinese people were great. They all want to be just like us, Christian potluck dinners, but it's the emperor that's stopping them from becoming Americanized. Then it was Mao in pajamas. He was keeping the people down. If we could just get rid of Mao, the Chinese people are going to rise up, demand democracy. And now, if you listen to it, there is no more China in Pompeo speak. It's the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, as if that's like three guys, and if we just move them, put them in another room, everything's going to be okay. There's 90 million people in the Chinese Communist Party. This is the largest, I call it a mandarin, the old mandarins. There's the emperor and the mandarin, Beijing, 90 million Chinese communists, populations larger than European countries. Very competent people who have to rise through a meritocracy to get where they are. And we are going to push this aside. The Chinese people are very happy with their government relatively. Nothing's perfect, but look at the accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese side. Then you'll see that Pompeo's just making this up.
Yeah, Tom, one of the things that when I look at media coverage of China, there's this amazing unwillingness to say the obvious of how has China has changed in the last 40 years. I mean, you'll always hear they're building more nuclear weapons and they're building their navy and all of their military technology, but they don't talk about how many people were pulled out of poverty and how China is on the cutting edge of so many technologies right now, because you can't admit that because then you have to look in the mirror and look at your own failings. And this is what American elites simply refuse to do, is that it's not the success of China. They don't want to talk about the success of China, but they certainly won't admit the neoliberalism, how it has really damaged the United States, its economy and its middle class. Go ahead.
You take a look at what's transpired in the People's Republic of China over the last half century. Clearly, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you point out the bad, then you're interfering with China's internal affairs, and you can get banned and pushed aside as it relates to working with the party and others within China. But as you pointed out, Peter, there has been. I mean, the fact is that China's pulled more people out of abject poverty than we have people in the United States of America, perhaps double that number. As we look at trying to hold China back, that's not going to happen. I mean, to think that somehow or another that we're going to thump our chest and China is going to bow to the United States is wishful thinking. And so while we need a defensive strategy to address the issues, the real issues with China, between the United States, China, and other democracies, we also need an investment strategy in the American people. When we take a look at what China is doing around artificial intelligence, big data, technology, it's not just the factory of the world anymore. They're in the game to win. I'm an old junior Golden Gloves boxer. Grew up in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And when I got into the ring, even with my best friend, I was there to win. And it should come as no surprise to us. I mean, I find it kind of amazing that people say China is looking to beat us. Well, no kidding.
Yeah, no kidding.
who strives to be number two. So China is going to be there. So the question has to be, whether it's to Biden or Trump, whoever's going to be the leader, what are you going to do to invest in infrastructure in America? Our roads, bridges, airports, the train system. I mean, it's a joke compared to what you see the investment of the Chinese people. So what are we going to do to invest in education, workforce development, research and development? Those are the issues that we need to focus on. And while we point to the boogeyman of China, that isn't doing a darn thing to the people that James talked about in those Midwestern states. I'm from one. I'm here in Michigan. We've certainly been hurt, not only by globalization in China, but automation and technology, which has really reaped havoc and has been similar to the economic tsunami that COVID-19 is unleashed on the world.
You know, James, I'm really glad that Tom mentioned this because, you know, competition, at least all three of us, I'm sure, were brought up, competition is good because it brings out the best in you. And it brings the best out in your opponent as well. But it's because China is just different. They must be unfair. They're cheating. They're not playing on a level playing field. You know, you always hear all these excuses here. No, just as we just heard, the U.S. just refuses to invest in itself and its people. And this is what happens. Okay, it's no surprise this has happened, and Tom was absolutely right. China's out there to win, and that makes perfect sense to me. And we need a policy that engages that avoids conflict, obviously, and actually competition can find profits for both sides if you look at it in a rational way. This is history. Great powers rise and fall. We may be in one of these moments now. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's tectonic plates changing. It's bigger than just the U.S. and China. A lot of changes taking place. But within the China-U.S. situation, yes, they want to win. And in my book, it goes back to, remember back in the 1990s when we had Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton and sex scandals, and the New York Times was full of 5 pages of detail about sex. And then we moved on to Bush, and we had to take trillions of dollars and put it in the sand in the Middle East. Well, in the 1990s, when we were arguing about nonsense, the founders of Huawei were sleeping on cement floors, dreaming of 5G. They were worried about their next meal. China was, you know, right now we're surprised, you know, China, AI and all this high tech, and we've got to invest and we've got to get going. I was touring China in the early 2000s, making these speeches. We've got to get going. We've got to stop investing in blowing up sand and start investing in our own country. There's a race for the future, and I could see it happening in China.
But we're going to go to a break, but we heard this in 2016. No one has heeded it. Okay, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on perceptions of China. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about perceptions and misperceptions of China. Okay, let's go back to Detroit. You know, Tom, one of the things that I've been observing here, particularly, there was a Pentagon report from the Defense Department about assessing China, and it was pretty grim reading. And I'd like to point everyone out, there's a wonderful article at the American Conservative that all sums it up. I think it's still on their front page. But it seems to me that there's always this kind of knee-jerk response when there's the Pentagon is, you know, it's a hammer and everything it sees in the world is a nail, okay? And we've seen, and we've talked about previously in the first part of the program, is that what ails America is not necessarily a China threat. It is the inability to respond to that threat. And I will invoke, you know, the military-industrial complex. This is another gravy train, just like the Korean Peninsula. It's just a gravy train for it. But don't change it. The status quo is great because everybody's making a lot of money. Don't tinker with NATO because everybody's making a lot of money. The same thing is happening now with China. Instead of engaging China, as a peer power, okay, which I think we all should admit, at least on most metrics here. But no, let's plan for military conflict. It seems to me that is so counterproductive to really what's really needed for that kind of relationship that we should have with China. Go ahead.
Well, it really goes back, when I reflect on it, growing up in DC in the 60s, and we didn't have any relationship with China, I remember two things. My mom telling me to eat my peas. The children are starving in China, and I still have the envelope to mail those peas to the children of China. And my dad telling me to stop digging in the backyard because I'm going to let the commies in and I'm going to fall into China. But in fact, I've written a children's book. I'm in the process of getting it published, where I talk about, that. And I've fallen into this hole that my dad told me about. And I look back from 1963, falling into the hole and waking up in China in 2020. And I look back through that hole to America. And I see the challenges that we are facing, whether it's with food insecurity, unemployment, the disaster on the response to the global pandemic. I mean, you can blame China for their slow response, but we have to take a look internally of what we did after we knew. We have serious problems in this country to address. The last thing that we need to do is be going on some military adventure and spending trillions of dollars in that fashion. Imagine if those dollars that James talked about a minute ago had been invested over the last few decades in the people of the United States of America and in other Western democracies, in making this world truly safer for us all. I think that we would see a different view of America when I look back through that hole that I fell into. So right now, China is not just eating our lunch, they're eating our dinner as well. If we don't get serious about investing in America, we're going to continue to have these problems.
But what I worry about, Tom, is that China will be the excuse not to invest. You see what I'm saying? This is the same thing, the same mindset. The Middle East is a strategic backwater of no strategic value to the United States whatsoever. The world is awash with oil. There's still a future Biden administration, and we're gonna go back into Syria, and we're not going to pull out troops here. I mean, this is always an excuse not to invest in the American people. James, I was in Beijing, I think it was 2 summers ago, and I was obviously invited to a number of presentations, and it was an amazing trip. And I, as a big talker, I always was asking questions, and I asked the same question to, I'd say, like a dozen people, and I'd say, what is the size of the middle class? Who's in the middle class? James, you know what? I got the same answer each time. We're all the middle class. And that is such a remarkable statement. And that shows us a level of confidence. See, when I went there and came back, I came away with the following. They know where they're going, they know how to get there, and they know they will get there. And that is a sense of confidence that I've never seen before. Maybe when I was a child in America, in the Midwest, that was an American way of thinking. It's not the case anymore. And so when I look at China, all of this chest beating, the Chinese just brush it off. We're going to get where we're going to get to. And if you want to get in the way, fine. But we're going to get where our destination. And I think that that's a self-confident society that I've never seen since my childhood. Go ahead, James.
I've never heard anybody say that, but that's exactly was my first impression when I first went to China, was that these guys have been around for a while. They know who they are. They know where they're going. And in their bodies, just the way they held themselves, talk to you, not arrogant, but we're 1/4 of humanity. We have this long history. We know who we are. We know where we're going. America doesn't have those plans. We just have the next election. Look, when John Kennedy took over from Eisenhower, Eisenhower said, your biggest problem is Laos. Kennedy didn't know anything about Laos. He reaches out for the levers that a president might have in Laos. And what were they? They were CIA, secret airline. Laos becomes the most bombed spot in the world. With China, we reach out. What do we have? Do we have like 30 years of Mandarin learning, like Sputnik that we started 30 years ago to, did we start our Huawei's in the 1990s? And we don't have any of those levers. We have the military lever. So we're confrontational in the South China Sea and in the Himalaya. And now we're in Thailand trying to do things. And, that's all we've got. And we should have more. We have to change this, and the time is nigh.
Go ahead, Dom.
Yeah, that is clearly a part of it. But the other is we're disinvesting in ways that are really frightening to me. It was announced today that we're kicking 1,000 students out of China. I mean, there's 300,000 students that are studying here in America. I mean, I believe that a future leader of China is in one of our universities today. So how we build this relationship and develop those soft power connections are going to be vitally important. And we're eroding a lot of the bridges that have been built between the people at the subnational level. Clearly, I think our Congress and the president should be dealing with some of these national issues of, unfair trade or theft of intellectual property or tension, whether it's in the Middle East or global economic theories. But at the subnational level, the governors, the mayors, superintendents of schools, university presidents, professors, we have to find ways to build that cultural, educational, and economic bridge between the second and the first largest economy in the world. To think otherwise is to dream a nightmare.
But James, the fundamental problem, as I see it, is that we always think of, we're told to think about China as, when you think in terms of its geography and the communist ideology, the party, the leader. But I think, both of you knowing Chinese history, China thinks of itself as a civilizational experiment, a phenomenon. It goes way beyond the CCP, okay? And the problem is here we have the largest population in the world that thinks of itself as a civilization for the good, and then you have American exceptionalism, and this is what makes it. That's why I don't like to look at the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But now we have a phenomenon here of the American elites are self-confident in American exceptionalism, even though they betray it all of the time. They pay lip service to it. Okay, and this is this clash right here because the U.S. is incapable of acknowledging a peer, a real peer, because the Soviet Union was never an economic threat, ever. There was almost no trade with it, okay? This is such a totally different situation right now, and I wonder if the American mindset is capable of adjusting to a peer. Go ahead, James.
I think maybe we're not capable of adjusting to a peer. If you listen to, the Pompeo's folks that he has out talking this anti-China thing,
Nuts.
And if you listen closely, in the third or fourth paragraph, when they get to the essence of the threat is American dominance. The threat is that China might become a leader. China's not going to bomb Chicago. China does not want to invade, go around the world and invade Argentina. What China wants to do is become a better China. And America is unable to accept that for a number of historical, racial, emotional reasons. And we're surprised that we're so challenged at this point. Well, what Tom just said about the challenges in America and we have to rebuild, I imagine he and I were talking this way about 20 years ago. At some point, America's either got to get on the train and compete, or we could be a rich number two. So what if China's the number one economic power in the world and we're number two? We could double the size of our economy in that world, but psychologically, we're not allowing ourselves to think that these Chinese really have their act together.
Yeah, there's no God-given right that America gets to remain number one. That old saying, number two tries harder. And China has been trying hard for over 4,000 years. And certainly as they struggled through the century of humiliation from 1849 to 1949, to kind of get back to where they were. I mean, a lot of people forget that China was the world's largest economy, probably 20 or 18 of the last 21 centuries. So somehow or another, the water reaping its own level should come as no surprise to us. We got to get up every day and compete to work to remain a number one. And as James pointed out, if China, because countries do surpass other countries, if you look back in our world history, it happens. I think as they say on the streets, stuff happens. So what are we going to do to assure that their rise doesn't come in our demise?
Yeah, but James, it seems to me that the thinking is reverse, and we've already touched on it. Is that if you make Americans stronger and give them a future and give them certainty, then that's a self-confident country on the world stage. It's not a self-confident country on the world stage because most people feel alienated from it, and no one has ever asked the American people what they think about China. We're just told what to think about China. And I think that is a real liability. It's much better to have a rich country where people have something invested in it. And I think then you would have a very different America. And just relying upon the military, well, we've seen what, particularly since the end of the Cold War, where that leads. An empty treasury, a lot of dead American soldiers, and the human casualties of these expeditions. It's been quite tragic and wasteful here. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have here. I want to thank my guests in Detroit and in New Zealand, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, CrossTalk rules.